I always tell people this, it's always important to note that we are about 50 years younger than the NBA. And so the progress that we're seeing is actually quite exponential if you are comparing it to the NBA at the same age.
Equal Pay Pioneers is presented by Cadillac.
I'm just so excited as to who I'm having a chat with today. Voted one of the top 25 WNBA players ever. She's an 8-time WNBA All-Star. She's a champion. She's an MVP. She's a Rookie of the Year. She's an all-defensive first teamer. She's president of the WNBA Players Association. I guess she sleeps. And more importantly, she's part of the first family of basketball. House Ogwumike, so incredibly impressive with those sisters. And with that intro, I'm so excited to be joined by the incomparable Nneka Ogwumike. Thanks for being here with us, Nneka. I know certainly you're busy, but I'm going to start with you in the same place that I start with all of our trailblazers that I've had the fortune of speaking with in the series. And that is, why, in your opinion, is equal pay so important for women?
Well, first of all, Elle, thank you for having me. It's always an honor to share some space with you, as you, of course, always use your platform to bring light to such important conversation. You know, it's not something that I always thought about necessarily, because I was kind of raised in a household where equity was foundational. It wasn't anything you needed to talk about, because it was something that us as 4 daughters in our household that we just understood was what we deserved. And of course, you know, as you navigate different spaces in this world, really all spaces when it comes to equity, especially for women, end up being just kind of a part of our existence and a part of the challenges that are really just kind of birthed onto us. And as I've kind of developed as this, not just a professional athlete, but a woman in business, a woman in leadership, this conversation is so important. It's one that I think, first and foremost, should not be feared. It should not be something that we should be scared to talk about. And bringing that type of awareness to the nature of this conversation is, I think, the first step to understanding exactly what equity means, what it is, what it hasn't been, and what we can do moving forward to make sure that it really is what we want it to be. And I'm just really grateful to be in a position to be working with so many women who teach me so much about the importance of equity in partnership, equity in business, and just really equity in citizenship. And I think the WNBA and the WNBPA do an amazing job of helping us understand where we are as we really kind of evolve with something that we're also passionate about.
You know what else the league does an incredible job of, Nneka, is just being trendsetters, of capitalizing on the moment. And I think we saw that in 2019 when Elle Jones, who at the time was head of the WNBA's content and influencer strategy, decides to unveil these orange hoodies that we seem to see absolutely everywhere at that time. Did you feel like the tides were turning after that successful marketing campaign?
I would say, like, midway through my career, I started sensing some type of shift, you know, and whether it was Ebb with the orange hoodie and even me, you know, being elected as the president in my first term, it wasn't anything that I thought I would be doing, first of all. And I didn't anticipate what that role meant, especially in the time that we were experiencing a lot of what we ended up advocating for, you know, in the WNBA and through the union. And so that shift brought a lot of energy to what was already in the fabric of our identity as women in sport and women in the WNBA. And along with, of course, you know, that branding of the orange hoodie, and then players coming out and speaking about the inequalities and the dangers of being Black in America. And that also leading into a collective bargaining agreement in which we had to negotiate our own value in this world, in this conversation of equity. It all kind of happened at the same time, but it almost felt as though each moment was preparing us for the next. And so that's why I always like to tell people when they ask, hey, what's next? Because we've always kind of appeared as a group of women who are always prepared for what happens. And really, we just try our best to be in the moment and educate ourselves and understand what's happening now so that whatever comes next, we are open and ready to tackle together.
You mentioned the CBA. You are now in your third term as president of the WNBA PA. And while that's something that you may have not seen for yourself, it will now be intrinsically linked to your legacy after what you all were able to do in negotiating that 2020 CBA. When you were going into that process, what to you was a non-negotiable for the CBA?
We can talk about the details of it. And of course, like one major detail was the resources that we now have around family planning. And, we have a larger salary cap. There's been a few changes to the player experience, but ultimately, I think, and I don't mean to put this figuratively, like ultimately, the biggest non-negotiable was change. We did not want to sign an agreement that reflected no change. The most historical and monumental aspects of us renegotiating the current CBA that we're in were the conversations that we had internally as just players, being able to speak up and honestly give a platform to players who don't normally have that platform to talk about their experiences, which we realized span a majority of the players in this league. You have all different ranges of players, whether it's franchise players, whether it's rookies, but the meat of a lot of that are the players in between that spectrum, and being able to open conversation for us to understand that, hey, everyone's having a similar experience. Everyone may have nuanced differences, but ultimately we all want the same thing. And making most everyone happy with those changes was what was most important. And that was reflected, of course, in the things that I talked about in the beginning.
We always tend to celebrate the destination. And while most of us aren't privy to the journey, can you share during that negotiation process, what was sort of the biggest hurdle that you had to overcome?
I think the biggest hurdle ended up being, I guess, the players' vision and the league's vision on the future of the league as it relates to prioritization and ultimately, of course, salary and compensation. Now, of course, we have player marketing agreements, we have team marketing agreements that allow players to earn valued compensation without having to go overseas if that's something that they don't want to do. But the prioritization penalizes each year players that pursue a career overseas that also want to play in the WNBA. And so that is challenging because we still have a lot of players that have to supplement a lot of their income overseas, and we don't want to take that opportunity away. We never want to take that opportunity away. I'm a player that benefited from being able to play year round in that way. And so ensuring that the prioritization of the W also matches the value in which is reflected in our salaries and compensation to ensure that players are making the best decisions for them to live out their dreams.
I feel like there's a lot of bad faith conversations surrounding WNBA negotiations from the public at large, maybe a miseducation as to what you're asking for and why the time is right. And I'm wondering, despite coming from a league of trailblazers, of women who have fought for equality and equity, why you feel like 2020 was the year you guys were finally able to get these sort of broad sweeping changes turned into something.
Absolutely. I think when you're speaking relatively, the conversation around salary and compensation, when you talk about the W alone, and then when you now bring in the conversation of salary when it comes to the NBA, those are two very separate conversations. And unfortunately, we always end up experiencing the result of comparing. And it's important, I always tell people this, it's always important to note that we are about 50 years younger than the NBA. And so the progress that we're seeing is actually quite exponential if you are comparing it to the NBA at the same age as the WNBA is today. And with that, of course, in modern times, especially with all of the accessible information that we have, things can be overlooked if people don't do enough research. And I think it's important to note the the impact of those conversations, because there's a lot of ignorance in this world and a lot of people who don't really want to do their due diligence that need to understand the difference between, us talking about charters and us talking about equity and investment. The latter really speaks to something that is much more sustainable, but the former is more of a headline that a lot of people kind of stop at without really considering what the equity investment of, say, for example, incorporating charter travel to a high level pro league would mean. And so those are things that at times we have to address, at times we ignore. But ultimately, I think we've landed in a position now where we're just here to have conversations with those who understand the true nature of that conversation.
By the way, some of these things that you all were asking for in the CBA, paid maternity leave, like what? Having the ability to stay in your own hotel room when you travel on the road. I mean, these are things that most of us would take for granted when it comes to some of the benefits of being a professional athlete. But you mentioned the men and the comparison to the men's league. And I wonder how you compartmentalize the responsibility that these men have to sort of helping and supporting the women's leagues, whilst also not constantly being in the comparison game with them.
It's really challenging at times, but I think also too, it's something that's always existed since we've been around, and we've learned how to navigate those things. And it's really just about aligning with those who understand the ethos and the vision that we see for these women leagues. And I also think it's very important that if we do talk about comparison, it's also important to talk about contrasting. And I think that's something that gets a lot of professional women's sports in a bind when it comes to seeking investment or even convincing others of our value, is that because we're constantly comparing, we're not recognizing that, yes, we play the same sports, but these are two very different leagues with two very different audiences, with two very different brand approaches and strategies. But that shouldn't mean that our value is diminished. It just means that there needs to be a different approach to how we can truly reflect our value, both for those who are, for the players who are playing in this league and for those who want to be involved in the success of it. And in a lot of ways, that comparison has lent an advantage to our understanding of who we are and where we want to go.
Amongst the many powers that women have, in my opinion, is their power of collaboration. And I've talked to a lot of women in this series about how when soccer was going through something, they would lean on hockey or vice versa, and they would share stories and they would help each other. And I'm wondering who you leaned on, who you used as a source of support and a resource while you were going through this and trying to create change in the WNBA.
Yeah, initially when we were negotiating our CBA, we leaned a lot on the players that came before us to learn about why it was maybe difficult to make changes. And, we stand on the backs of so many pioneers in the WNBA and the work of a lot of the former executive committee members and player representatives in the WNBPA. And so we leaned a lot on that. And we have an amazing staff, especially in our executive director and Terry Jackson, who helped also put together a board of advocates that helped us as we were trying to negotiate, say, for example, our current collective bargaining agreement. And ultimately, when we were able to sign it, we started getting into more conversation with other women's leagues, including the NWSL and those who are in the NWHL. And it's just amazing it was amazing in that moment to see, and not even just limited to women's leagues, but women, working women across the board were applauding us for what we were able to attain in our collective bargaining agreement, which to me was such a surprise because, as someone in sport, your job is not at all really ever considered conventional. And so we're thinking that we're fighting for things that already exist, but we were actually opening doors and minds for those who may not necessarily be in a non-conventional job to also fight for those equalities and equities. And so it was really wonderful to be able to open those conversations and really create an even larger alliance across the board as we work towards equity.
I've talked a lot, especially over the last couple of years, Nneka, about meeting the moment. And you come from a great family in Texas. You're a basketball player who wanted to have a professional career. You were a psychology major in college. And now you are part of a key cog that created instrumental change, generational change in the WNBA. And for the folks that are watching right now, be it young girls or old ladies like me, who want to impact their communities or want to create change or be a disruptor, but just don't know where to start, what would be your advice on meeting the moment?
This question becomes hard, or seeking the answer to this type of reflection is difficult because we feel as though there's one way to use our voice. We feel as though there's one way to lead, but the reality is that we're all unique and we all add a different value to any room that we enter. And recognizing that, and of course, surrounding yourself with those who also recognize that in themselves is, I think, the most authentic and I would say like the softest way to enter that type of space. And I say soft because we need to give each other grace when we enter spaces where we're trying to let our voice be heard. And so being gentle with yourself in that way and recognizing that you have a value that no one else can bring, and surrounding yourself with those who recognize that value and recognize value in themselves, I think is the surest way to really go out there and make a difference. And a difference does not have to be big. I think also applying how you use your voice to what it is you want to speak on, and understanding that the difference does not have to be monumentally large. It doesn't have to be grandiose in nature. It's something that can be small. One, it just takes one person. It just takes speaking up one time for you to develop and really massage that muscle that can ultimately lead to, the change that we hope to see in ourselves and in those who support us.
Certainly any advice from the great Nneka Ogwumike is advice to take to the heart. Thank you so much for not only your time today, but for your continued efforts in creating space and in disrupting. Thank you for what you've done and continue to do. And we hope to talk to you soon.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
This episode of Equal Pay Pioneers is presented by Cadillac. Be iconic.